The five of us gathered in the cozy living room of our apartment, a familiar scene since we married 3 years ago and began hosting our parents. Yet, tonight's atmosphere was starkly different from the relaxed warmth of our last Sunday dinner. A heavy tension settled over the room, suffocating the usual lightheartedness. My mother sat beside me, her fingers wrapped gently around mine, a silent gesture of support. On my other side was Lisa, soon to be my ex-wife, her presence beside me more symbolic than comforting. Across from us, her parents sat stiffly, their expressions drawn tight with worry and exhaustion. I had asked Lisa to let me take control of the conversation, and though she had reluctantly agreed, her silence was tinged with unease. She had already voiced her thoughts earlier, lamenting my father's absence. "I wish your father were here," she had murmured, her voice laced with emotions I couldn't quite decipher. I had only nodded in response, unwilling to admit how relieved I was that he wasn't. His presence would have only intensified the conflict. His long-standing disdain for Margaret, my mother-in-law, would have made any hope for civility an illusion. Yet, despite knowing this, I couldn't deny the longing for his unwavering support, the steady assurance in his gaze that had always urged me to stand my ground. After a week of relentless turmoil, I was determined to remain composed. My father-in-law, breaking the heavy silence, finally spoke. "Danny, thank you for meeting with us," he said, his voice weary, his face etched with fatigue. He had the look of a man who had lost too many nights to sleepless worry, and I could see the same exhaustion mirrored in Lisa's features. Despite everything, a flicker of sympathy stirred within me. He had always struck me as a fundamentally decent man, though often too hesitant to confront his wife and daughter. Margaret, on the other hand, radiated an entirely different energy. She stood rigid, her presence imposing, her fiery temperament barely restrained. A woman who refused to be addressed as anything but Margaret, she had made no secret of her contempt for me, a bitterness she never bothered to disguise. She had loathed me from the start, believing I had stolen her daughter away. To her, our failing marriage was nothing more than vindication, proof that I had never deserved Lisa in the first place. Lisa, clad simply in jeans and a fitted shirt, looked effortlessly beautiful despite the tear stains on her cheeks. That timeless girl-next-door charm, the one that had drawn me to her in the first place, still lingered. But beneath it, the pain was evident. My heart clenched as I looked at her, but I forced myself to stay detached. The wound was too fresh, the betrayal too raw. She had been staying at her parents' house since our marriage unraveled, and this was the first time we had spoken face to face since that night. The night I had stopped answering her calls, the night I had finally given up. Talking over the phone had become pointless, her justifications growing weaker with every attempt. It had taken me too long to realize that my understanding of her had always been naive. My father-in-law, his voice laced with quiet desperation, tried to reach across the chasm between us. "This has been hard for you too," he offered. "But perhaps we can talk, find a way." I shook my head. "We don't have children to consider. Trying to fix what's broken is futile." I appreciated his sentiment, but there was no salvaging what had already crumbled. The path forward was clear. Lisa's voice was barely above a whisper, her words fractured by emotion. "I don't want a divorce." I turned to her, my expression impassive. I knew what had brought us here. The image burned into my mind like a scar. At her sister's wedding, the last thing I had expected to witness was my wife wrapped in the arms of her ex-boyfriend. The way she clung to him, the way they moved together, had ignited a rage so fierce I could barely contain it. "Mom," I started, my voice laced with frustration, addressing Margaret directly. She cut in sharply. "There's no need for that language, Daniel." Her chastisement only fueled my irritation. "This isn't your place, Maggie," I snapped, the name deliberately chosen to provoke. "You can leave any time." Surprisingly, she held her tongue. For once, she didn't unleash her fury, and that silence caught me off guard. Lisa sobbed openly now, her anguish written across her face. "It was a mistake," she choked out, her eyes pleading. A bitter smile twisted my lips. "A mistake?" My voice dripped with sarcasm. "What part exactly? Was it getting drunk and thinking it was perfectly fine to dance provocatively with your ex in front of everyone? Or was it when you boldly told the crowd that you could dance with whomever you pleased?" Lisa's face flushed crimson, but I didn't stop. "Or maybe," I continued, my voice sharp as a blade, "the real mistake was mine, because less than an hour later, when I let my guard down, I found you kissing him. Openly. In front of everyone." A heavy silence fell over the room. I thought I was doing the right thing when I confronted him, I admitted, my voice low. But when I looked back at you, you weren't horrified. You weren't remorseful. You were furious with me. Lisa let out a strangled sob. I regret it so much, Danny. I don't know why it happened. I don't know what came over me. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. You want to know why? I asked, my voice devoid of warmth. Because your sister, Stephanie, taught you exactly how to get a man's attention at your bachelorette party. And you volunteered to pass that knowledge on to her younger sister. Her eyes widened in horror. I saw the video, I continued mercilessly. Technology is incredible, isn't it? It captured everything. Every move you made with those two male dancers. Lisa paled, her breath hitching as realization dawned. She buried her face in her hands, groaning. Oh my God! The weight of the truth hung in the air, undeniable, irreversible. There was no way forward for us. Only the inevitable end we had both been avoiding. I had loved her. Maybe a part of me always would. But love alone was not enough to save us. The weight of uncertainty pressed heavily upon Lisa as she hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if Mike knows about this. I mean, he doesn't have to know about the dancers, right? Her words trembled with anxiety, and both Marge and Phil could see the embarrassment and fear etched into her expression. The air in the room thickened with an unbearable silence, punctuated only by Lisa's deepening sobs. As the conversation spiraled into unfamiliar territory, Marge, unbothered by the emotional turmoil, delivered a statement that left me reeling. This situation is more serious than you think, Danny. Before I could respond, Phil raised a hand, signaling for me to stay silent. His voice, calm but weighted, cut through the tension. Yes, it's serious, but this is just one example. I'm sure your son could clarify. Mr. Thomas, maintaining his composure, turned toward me. Lisa, this isn't a one-time thing. I turned my gaze back to my wife, noticing how her face had drained of all color. I remember seeing a video from your sister's bachelorette party. The way you acted that night, how easily you let yourself be swept up in it. It's clear now, you've been hiding things. You and your sister, with those dancers, it was all captured on film. Lisa couldn't meet my eyes anymore. Her body seemed to shrink in on itself, her shoulders trembling as she buried her face in her hands. The weight of shame bore down on her. But before the silence could consume the room, Maggie, ever the opportunist, smiled smugly. You should be careful, Danny, she said smoothly, her eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite place. It looks like your actions aren't as innocent as you think. Without another word, she pulled a small envelope from her bag and handed it to me. You know what this is? Her tone was sharp, cutting through the last remnants of my patience. Inside the envelope were photographs, grainy yet damning, of a motel I had supposedly stayed at last month, alongside confirmation details from the establishment itself. A sinking feeling gripped my chest as I realized what this meant. Lisa remained silent, the air between us growing heavier with unspoken words. Maggie continued, her voice laced with satisfaction. I think it's fair to say, Danny, that you're not in a position to pass judgment on anyone else. You've had your own secrets. A deep silence settled over us until my mother, who had remained a silent presence up until now, finally spoke. Her voice, gentle yet firm, carried a soothing cadence. Don't worry, Danny. We've been handling this for a while. The ladies at the church have been talking to me about this. Everyone knows about the reception and the affair. I struggled to maintain my composure. Though I appeared outwardly calm, my mind was a tempest of emotions. The truth lay bare before me. Both sides had failed each other. And now there was no choice but to confront it all. Handing the letter to my mother, I noted the redness in her eyes from reading its contents. Offering her a reassuring smile, I gently patted her hand before shifting my gaze back to Maggie. Before you start inventing your own theories, you'd better sharpen your detective skills, I said coolly. My employer sent me to Chicago for 4 days of certified training. Even though there was no actual business involved, I can confirm, along with the other participants, that I attended every single one of those tedious meetings. Maggie narrowed her eyes, her smugness faltering. As for Lisa's car, it was in the shop. So she borrowed one while I was away. You do know Lisa's colleague from the clinic down south, Dr. Samey? His full name is Samuel Jonathan Smith, MD. I let my words hang in the air before adding. But if you're still focused on this, let me clarify things. Before I could continue, my concerned father-in-law interrupted, his voice tight. He's older than you. I hope your daughter finds the support she needs. I turned to him, my voice devoid of warmth. It seems she may have deeper issues. Lisa let out a faint murmur, but I had no patience left for hollow words. I think we've discussed everything we need to. Standing, I felt a growing vulnerability, the weight of this confrontation threatening to consume me. A prolonged silence filled the room before I made my final request. Please leave. Phil helped Lisa to her feet, his movements heavy with resignation. Maggie, however, stood her ground, her fiery glare burning into me. Daniel, I expected more from you. My patience snapped. I've always anticipated hypocrisy and judgment from you. Now, please, leave my apartment. Maggie stormed out, her rage tangible in the sharpness of her movements. Phil followed closely, pausing only to briefly embrace me before disappearing after his wife and daughter. Lisa lingered for a moment, her tear-swollen face filled with regret. The guilt in her gaze was unmistakable. She whispered, "I'm so sorry." I didn't respond. Instead, I stared at the door, my only source of solace in that moment. A single tear slipped down my cheek. She was gone, and she had taken everything with her. Trying to understand why she had cheated wouldn't save our marriage. The betrayal ran too deep. It had always been doomed from the start. The pain, the anger, the sheer helplessness, it all seemed never-ending. Despite everything, I still loved her. And that realization hurt the most. My mother approached, wrapping me in a warm embrace. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. "Not at all," I admitted, my voice raw with emotion. "It'll take time, but I'll find a way to move on." She offered a gentle suggestion. "What's your next step? Your father would be proud of how you're handling this." I nodded. The thought of a public reckoning, like the one Maggie had inadvertently suggested, held a certain appeal. After Sunday's church service, there would be no more loose ends. Lisa would receive the divorce papers soon. I also considered taking legal action against Dr. Sam's clinic, though I doubted it would be successful. If the video had reached me, then surely Mike had seen it too. I decided to give Stephanie a week to tell him the truth. Perhaps, unlike us, they could find a way forward. Sensing my mother's knowing smile, I turned to her. She handed me a recorder. "Your father wanted me to record this meeting," she said gently. "His absence today was nearly unbearable. He understands why you kept him away, but it still bothers him." I sighed deeply, the weight of years pressing down on my shoulders. 5 years, and I'm exhausted. But not broken. The struggles I had endured would either shape me into a stronger man, or leave me forever scarred. I frowned, the idea of love and marriage feeling distant, unattainable. I don't think I'll ever believe in it again. My mother stepped back slightly, her smile tinged with understanding and quiet hope. "You're 27, dear. Finding someone special takes time. But I believe you'll succeed." Her optimism, though faint, lifted a small part of my spirit. I smiled at her, admiring her resilience. She kissed my cheek softly and held out her hand. "I still look forward to meeting your future children." We chuckled together, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a sliver of hope. Perhaps, in time, happiness would find its way back to me.